So my name is Francine Darroch, and I'm a community-based researcher at Carleton University in Ottawa. And I am the lead researcher on this study that we'll be talking about today with my co-PI, Lindsay Hayhurst out of York University. So today I will be presenting on behalf of my research group with my colleagues from the University of Ottawa, Diane and Tiago, who are experts in the area of social learning theory. So before we get into the crux of our conversation today, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Carleton University operates and where I am located today is on the unceded, unsurrendered traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We also want to acknowledge the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples globally and encourage everyone to reflect on the traditional territory that you are currently located on. So just as a brief overview of what we hope to accomplish today, we'll start by discussing trauma and violence-informed physical activity and what we mean by that language. We will then, I'll turn the floor over to my colleagues to discuss communities of practice and landscapes of practice. Then we'll turn to our rationale for this project, and then we will have a voluntary interactive component, which will happen in the second half of this, and then we'll do a final wrap up. So I want to note that this work has been made possible by the Public Health Agency of Canada funding through the call, Preventing and Addressing Family Violence, the Health Perspective. So this larger study aims to improve support to enhance the health and wellness of individuals who have experienced family violence. Through a multidimensional approach, we will evaluate scalable, sustainable models of promoting equitable access to physical activity programs. The development of a landscape of practice is one aspect of this larger four-year project. So we're really pleased to be working with our partners on the ground, YWCA Crabtree Corner, St. Mary's Home, Ottawa Community Housing Foundation, and MLSE Launchpad, and potentially many of you through this landscape of practice. Just so we are all on the same page, for our research, we use the language of trauma and violence-informed physical activity, which we often refer to as TVIPA. And we define this as an approach to physical activity that accounts for intersecting effects of systemic, structural, and interpersonal violence in the development, implementation, and delivery of physical activity programming. So rather than listen to me chat about this, my wonderful graduate students co-created an animated video that provides a brief overview of trauma and violence-informed physical activity.
For many of us, when we think of physical activity, we often picture going out for a bike ride, heading to soccer practice, joining a Pilates class, or spending the day in the garden. We're often told to do it because it's good for stress management and overall health. But what we often don't consider are the marginalizing circumstances, such as racism, living in poverty, experiences of domestic and structural violence, histories of trauma, or substance use stigma, which can create barriers to people accessing and participating in physical activity. The reality is that accessibility to physical activity is significantly impacted by the social, economic, emotional, and physical environments in which we live. When these factors aren't addressed, it can seriously impact participation. Recognizing and acknowledging these barriers is the first step to promoting equitable access to physical activity. That means addressing obstacles individuals face due to gender discrimination, heterosexism, racism, socioeconomic disadvantage and poverty stigma, and barriers to education. Trauma and violence-informed physical activity, or TVIPA, is one approach to reducing these barriers and improving access to physical activity resources. TVIPA is a powerful practice that recognizes the beneficial effects of physical activity for the psychological health, physical health, and overall well-being of people living in marginalizing circumstances. TVIPA establishes supportive environments where participants can build positive relationships with physical and social engagement. TVIPA also brings awareness to the widespread effects of marginalization, trauma, and violence, with roughly 70% of adults experiencing at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, such as intimate partner violence, adverse childhood events, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. So, how can we reimagine physical activity environments through a trauma and violence-informed lens to create safe, non-violent environments in which individuals can feel empowered to make choices, collaborate, and learn? Ensure all staff are aware of the widespread impact of trauma and how it can affect the emotions and behaviors of people or groups. Have community members co-create and co-lead programming. Offer free or affordable programming. Make plans for sustainable and consistent programs. Provide activity variations to support all levels of abilities. Use non-controlling language, offering options such as, if you're comfortable. Use invitational language and encourage people to make individual choices and to listen to their bodies. Use diverse images in physical spaces and advertising. Be flexible with timing, allowing individuals to join programming at any point. Offer self-identified women-only classes. Offer childcare. Offer snacks and food support. Offer gender-neutral bathrooms. Celebrate people for making the effort to show up. When possible, ensure participants have the gear required to take part, such as running shoes, sports bras, water bottles. By starting to break down the barriers to participating in physical activity, we can begin to rethink the best ways to address obstacles and create equitable opportunities for all individuals to achieve positive health outcomes and lead healthy lives.
Okay, so just as sort of a background as to why I'm interested in this and partially why we're here today is my research has always focused on physical activity, but when I wanted to focus on trauma-informed approaches to my work, I ended up training with leaders in the area of trauma-informed practice in nursing, doctors Colleen Varco and Annette Brown at UBC. And at that time, I found it difficult to connect with many folks who were doing physical activity, trauma-informed physical activity work. While there has certainly been a lot done in this arena, I think that we can do a better job of supporting, sharing, and learning from one another. So that is, ultimately why we are all here today. So at this point, I would like to pass the baton over to my colleague, Diane, to talk to us about social learning, communities of practice, and landscapes of practice.
Hello, thanks, Francine. So yes, I am from the University of Ottawa. I've been a prof there since 2007, but I've been working with the theory and the idea of communities of practice since 1999, which is pretty much the year after the book on communities of practice came out. So much of my research has been around building learning capacity in sport, especially sport leadership for around coach development, women in sport, and coaching for parasport. So I'm very happy with my colleague, Tiago, who you will be hearing from more in a little while. We've done a lot of projects together. We launched a lot of communities of practice. In fact, we just did one yesterday for sports safety for professional coaches in Canada. So we hope that this presentation today or your time today will give you a little bit of a taste about what social learning is that underlies the concept of communities of practice, landscapes of practice, and also to try out a little bit the space that we're using, which is our shared mural space. You'll be getting into that a bit later. So So underlying social learning theory is the concept that it's about learning to make a difference. So one assumes that we're all here today because we'd like to make a difference related to trauma and violence informed physical activity. This actually has a double meaning, learning to make a difference. So it can be learning in order to make a difference, as well as learning how to make a difference. So while many people have been either formally or informally part of social learning spaces, communities of practice, oftentimes this goes kind of unnoticed that's actually what, the space is that you're engaging in. However, it does take a marked change of direction from what we think of in terms of traditional learning settings in our education system. So we'll move to the next slide, please. So the basic assumptions underlying social learning theory are that as human beings, we are fundamentally social beings, that learning is at the core of our existence, and that as we learn, we become. So since the very start of our time as a species on this earth, many thousands of tens of thousands of years ago, we, long before we even really communicated very effectively by writing or even by speaking, we relied on each other and learned how to survive by interacting with the others and the environment that we were in, and pushing our learning through our experiences of overcoming various barriers. So this is why we say also learning is at the core of our existence. But I think, we only have to think about our nature as human beings that, for instance, toddlers, one of their most favorite words after no is why. why? And also the fact that, often if you drive by a car accident, you probably, one of the first things you're going to do is try and figure out what happened. You want to try and learn from that experience, hoping that, something like that doesn't happen to you or those you care about. So we have this innate desire to learn. And the theory is a theory that's based on the concept of constructivism, although we do have intersubjective learning, i.e. we learn from each other and through each other in our interactions. But essentially, it's a lifelong learning approach in which, as we learn, we become. So our cognitive structure or our biographies change with all the experiences we have, or we may decide not to change our cognitive structure if we decide it's not that important. So hopefully that's not the case today. Hopefully you are actually engaging with us instead of deciding that you don't want to learn. And you are going to leave here, each of you, in some different way, with some learning experience that makes you a slightly different person than you were at the beginning of the session. So, yep, thank you. So what are communities of practice? They are an initiative to connect people with a passion for learning, developing, and growing together related to their practice. And so the central concepts, and this relates back to what we just talked about, the three basic assumptions, is that learning and meaning and identity. So as we become, we change. So it affects our identity. We identify with our practice. And in our community of practice, as we learn, much of it will be around negotiating the meaning of different practices and concepts as they relate to our practice. Next slide, please. So initially when the Wenger, right, who's the person who really wrote the book on communities of practice and developed it, he talked about constellations of communities of practice. In other words, in our lives, we'll have different practices that we engage in, and probably different communities of practice around those practices. And then the people in our communities of practice will also have their own different communities that they're involved in. And so what that ends up looking like is what did that now, since about 2015, call a landscape of practice, which is this, so if we take the landscape of practice of sport in Canada, we can think about, the Sport Canada and the funding from the federal government, and it goes down through the provincial and territorial bodies, goes down to local sport organizations, clubs, community centers, and so on, coaches, athletes, parents, all are part of the landscape of practice of sport in Canada. So, but if you think of a profession like, let's say, law, there's no way that one community of practice contains all the knowledge of a profession like law. There's too many different facets, right? And the numerous codes and so on. So it's more like a landscape of practice where, if you're part of a certain, let's say, a community of practice of lawyers that are dealing with family law, they will not be competent in all types of law. They will be competent in their own specialty, which is family law. However, they are part of this big landscape, and as often might happen, they may have to refer to somebody else in the landscape who's a specialist, maybe in contract law or something like that. So a complex system of communities of practice and the boundaries between them and all the different networks is how you define a landscape of practice. So that is what Francine and her team and her co-investigator are hoping to create here with all of you who are interested in this topic of trauma and violence informed physical activity from across the landscape of physical activity in Canada. Next, please. So what happens in a community of practice or in a social learning space? So this is from a model that we created for sport organizations. And we have at the top left, we say, we do stuff together because we want to make a difference. And then in the middle, I love being with others who recognize the difference I want to make and who appreciate my uncertainty, knowing that I've got issues that I need to deal with in my practice that I don't know how to deal with. I leave my meetings with my colleagues out of this community of practice with ideas, tips, tools, friendships, and a network. And I take those back to my practice where I put them into use. And then I see the effect of using those tips, tools, whatever, and then take those back to my community of practice, the other people who care to make a difference. So what we see is this cycle of collective and individual reflection and action. And in this way, you don't know necessarily what the knowledge is that you need when you go into, a practice like this or a social space like this, social learning space. That's fine. That's the whole idea. You're trying to, within a space like this, push your knowledge beyond the edge of the collective knowledge of the group. There is also a lot of knowledge sharing that will take place as well. So if you go to the next slide, please, you'll see three really important things that these bubbles relate to, which are critical to learning to make a difference. So the first is, what is the topic that I want to make a difference about? So in a community of practice, that's usually narrowly focused on a specific practice, whereas in a landscape of practice, it's around the topic, but it's not necessarily the exact same practice. So like we could say that athletes, I'll use my own field to explain this, we could say that athletes and coaches are all part of the landscape of practice, let's say at the University of Ottawa, and the GGs, they're all part of the landscape of practice, but the practice of a coach is not the same as the practice of an athlete. An athlete's practice is to be the best athlete they can be, whereas the coach's practice is to actually help the athletes be the best that they can be. So they do not have the same practice. They do not belong to the same community of practice. They're a team, but they're part of a landscape of practice and not the same community of practice. And then I have talked a little bit more about this, but the idea of appreciating uncertainty, not knowing exactly where we're going to be going and being comfortable with that is super important. So what that means is the safe space, and I'll get to that a little bit in the ground rules. We have to respect people's opinions and allow people to express, because you never know where that might go. And that uncertainty could lead to a really useful change in your practice. And finally, the lower bubble with the yellowy green is very important, is to pay attention to the effects of what you're doing in your practice and to report that back to your community of practice or your landscape of practice. So this way it's like a laboratory where everybody can go out and try all different things, and all those who are interested in that specific idea, tool, concept can benefit from your paying attention and reporting back. And this also helps us to create value, learning value within the community of practice or landscape of practice. We pay attention to what's working, or maybe we did an activity, you know what, it didn't really affect our practice that much. So maybe we need to step back and redesign that so that we can actually move the practice forward. Okay, next slide, please. So just some basic ground rules. As I alluded to, it's very, very important to leave the egos at the door. We want to have as much as possible within this landscape of practice for learning. We want to have a non-hierarchical structure, a flat structure. So if you got your boss involved in this and you're in it too, everybody's on the same level. So all voices should be heard with equal respect and withholding of judgments. And very importantly, divergent opinions are good. In fact, they're super important. If we only agreed on everything, we would not be advancing our practices at all. So we need to be comfortable with being challenged and allowing ourselves to think outside the box and let, different ideas come into our heads about, just because I've been doing it this way all along and it worked well, it doesn't mean that there isn't something else I could do to change that. So this sharing and co-creating of knowledge really does require open-mindedness within the social learning space, which would be the landscape of practice and the community of practice. So that's it for me. And I think I'm handing it back over to Francine.
Yes, thank you. That was such a great, excellent summary of social learning spaces. So as was noted over the past slides that Diane spoke to, we thought a focused social learning space would be a solid strategy to connect various folks that are working in this area. And our sort of key rationale for exploring this initially was that we wanted to increase access to and improve awareness of the potential benefits of trauma-informed approaches. We wanted to support new leaders in the field. So anybody who's sort of taking on this work, be it as, researchers, practitioners, folks who are, community organizations, to really support them in getting up and running. We wanted to sustain and scale up some of the trauma-informed efforts that have taken place already. And ultimately, we just wanted to increase uptake of physical activity programming, which, it means improving access and all of these things that were discussed within our brief animation video. So in 2020, we started some research. So we had piloted trauma and violence informed physical activity programming in Vancouver and the downtown east side. And we learned so many lessons and we did so many things wrong. And we thought it would be great to have these conversations with other folks to try and figure out what works, what are some good strategies that other folks are using. So we wanted to consider if trauma-informed social learning space was of interest to other people in this area and outside of it, and really sort of assess what trauma-informed physical activity social learning space could look like. So given the time constraints, not the time constraints also, but the constraints of the global pandemic, we conducted 11 semi-structured interviews online with folks who identify as either, being engaged in trauma-informed physical activity, as well as those with experience in social learning spaces. So based on the data from these interviews, there was certainly an interest in creating this social learning space. And within that, the landscape of practice really sort of met the needs of the community. And that was, of course, through conversation with Diane and Tiago, who told us we weren't actually creating a community of practice. It was a landscape of practice based on the populations we wanted to focus on and work with. So the participants in this study really noted that if we were going to create this space, it had to be multidisciplinary and involve different stakeholders, including those with lived and living experience of trauma, researchers, physical activity, practitioners, coaches, folks who are organizations that are offering different types of programming, and TVIPA practitioners. They also noted that we really needed to create a space with diverse membership. And this was, stressed because it was valuable in providing different perspectives and enhancing knowledge transfer and knowledge creation. And again, Diane really highlighted how these social learning spaces can aid in that process. The importance of aligning the goals with the community was highlighted. And this is really why we're here today. We sort of have this general idea, but we want to shape it based on the input from you folks who are here and others who kind of couldn't make it today. And we want to determine or co-determine what the objectives, learning goals, and activities of this group will be. And finally, the interview participants really urged us to explore power dynamics and to understand that members will hold varying levels of personal and institutional power, which of course results in power differentials. And they also, in line with assessing and figuring out these power differentials, they highlighted that we needed to take a trauma-informed approach. And we really needed to integrate trauma and violence informed tenets within this space in sort of how we're functioning and how we move forward with it. So the objective of this co-created landscape of practice is to increase access and uptake of trauma and violence informed physical activity programs for individuals who have or are experiencing violence and trauma. So at this point, I'm going to stop recording the session as we transition into a more interactive component.